Welcome to this week's edition of Invest Africa. I'm Alicia Sekum. The theme for the 23rd edition of the World Economic Forum on Africa is delivering on Africa's promise. But before this promise can be delivered, there are a myriad of issues that need to be tackled, and also the question around how WEF can help facilitate Africa's agenda and aspirations. Joining me in studio to share their impressions and opinions about the World Economic Forum is Yunus Suleiman. He's chairman of KPMG for South Africa and Africa. Also with us is Claude Bessak, economist from Mix. Thanks, gentlemen, for joining us this afternoon. And Yunus, let's start off with you, because as we've highlighted, the focus is on the World Economic Forum on Africa, and the theme this year is delivering on Africa's promise. Now, it's one thing being said, another thing this actually translating into reality, and that brings us to the age-old question around forums like these in the first place. Are we looking at just another talk shop?
I hope not. I think that we may not necessarily be able to quantify the outcomes, but I think it does realize some collaboration arrangements and some focus on the actual issues facing the continent. So in this context, I think the WEF, there's a huge expectation that it goes beyond just being a talk shop, and that we would focus a lot more on helping the global landscape lift out of this economic depression.
Claude, we've had many getting excited about the fact that the theme is focused around delivery. Where are your expectations sitting right now?
Well, I think in terms of the forum itself, I tend to agree with Yunus. It's hugely important for business leaders and for government officials and international organizations to meet and talk. I think historically in Africa there's been great distance between business on one hand and governments on the other hand, for historical reasons. And these kind of forums allow that kind of historical negative to dissipate and a more cooperative relationship to take place. And it's no chance that it's happening at a time when Africa's growth has increased significantly and there is more foreign investment and economic activity in Africa. So certainly these kind of forums are very, very important in terms of creating that environment. It's much more difficult to say exactly what they do, but they create the conversation, they create an environment where issues can be tackled fairly openly and honestly. And they create a bit of that buzz, that Africa is open for business and come to listen to us and come to contribute, and hopefully that will contribute to growth. Obviously, a lot of the important social partners are left out of those conversations, and they make themselves heard. The key question for me becomes, how do we increase the size of the tent, and how do we make other social groups more represented, more present? And I'm particularly thinking about the millions of Africans who are not benefiting from growth.
Yunus, is it inclusive enough, a forum like this, and the agenda that's being put on the table as well?
I think there's a diverse group of participants, much more diverse than I've historically found it to be. So I think that, not everyone gets invited, but I think when I look at the actual participants list, it's really across the globe, and it's including all facets of life, including especially the young global leaders. I think they come from diverse backgrounds as well. But I think it's enough to really get the show on the road in terms of being more than a talk shop.
Yunus, I asked a question because I've come across the phrase Africa hype phenomenon and doubt that we're on our way to becoming a hub for growth. Furthermore, being highlighted that at these growth rates that we're looking at right now, they're generally coming off low bases, so nothing really to get excited about here. So there are quite a few cynics that sit out there as well. What's your response to those cynics?
If you look at the fact that we've got literally 90% of the world's platinum, we've got half of the world's gold, and so on. The growth rates are much higher than everywhere else in the world, and that's not something to sneeze at. So I think with looking at also the fact that you have at least 6, if not higher, of the fastest growing economies in the world based in Africa, you have to look at it seriously as a global investor and consider where the opportunities lie. And the benefit of WEF is to have a lot of people that are in this complex that you can talk to, which is not that easy to get through to in their offices. And that's, I think, a fundamental benefit, is that it's connectivity, it's networking. It's more than just sitting and listening to the discussions in the rooms.
And for the most part, Claude, I mean, that's where the spotlight has been, the continent's resilience and weathering this global economic storm, so to speak, with an expected annual growth rate of 5% in 2012-2013, and almost half of Africa's countries having attained middle income status as well. But focus is also now on sustaining that growth moving forward. How are you rating Africa's vulnerabilities at this stage?
It's an interesting question. It's a difficult one to answer. But in a nutshell, I think what we've seen is significant improvement in that resiliency. Not necessarily because there's been a change in the sectoral focus, and that's a big question for Africa, but because there's been a change in the source of investment geographically. There's been an opening of Africa to emerging markets, India, China, obviously, but Latin American countries also are participating, and increase in intra-African investment and trade. These have explained to some extent the fact that Africa has not suffered to the extent that other economies suffered from the global slowdown or meltdown and slowdown that has followed. But also a great concern is the fact that the growth of Africa is greater nowadays, today, than it ever was. Based on its dependency on its exports of unprocessed commodities, and particularly oil and gas. And that means that that growth is fairly hollow. There is a lack of manufacturing response. There's in fact a significant decrease in the share of manufacturing, in the share of GDPs in Africa over the past 10, 15 years. Same for agriculture. And all those analysts who point to us that, well, but services are making up for that difference, well, clearly not, because these services are domestic consumption services and not export market services. So what you have is you have a diversified growth generation from the source of the markets that are consuming our commodities. But there is still a lack of economic diversification. And we haven't been able as yet to reproduce the Asian or the Latin American model of getting consistently and competitively into value-added manufacturing, transformation. And real economic development must come from that, because resource-based development is not job creating. And this explains to some extent why we still have tremendous amount of poverty and massive amount of youth unemployment. These people are not finding a share in that growth.
So at this point, let's bring into the conversation now a guest from Durban, Gregory Knott, who's director at Worksman's Attorneys, joins us on the line. Gregory, thanks so much for joining us on the line this afternoon. Let's get straight into your perspective on what we need to be doing more of to fine-tune the model that has buffered us and served us pretty well through this global economic crisis.
Hello, Lucia. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you. I've heard the comments and they're all very sound, and I must echo them. I think Africa has really so much promise, and we've delivered to a great degree the last few years. If one just points to energy and has a look at the energy field, and I'll hear about the manufacturing and so on, but in South Africa, the renewable program, for instance, has delivered enormously in regard to local content, local manufacture, and so on. If that sort of program can be mirrored and propagated through the rest of Africa, we'll see great success. And let me just touch upon that for a brief minute. Integration, collaboration, and cooperation is hugely important. I've seen that from my last WEF meeting I attended in Dar, Tanzania, where we had presidents and prime ministers sitting discussing with just the local delegates in regard to how do we integrate across the African continent on issues such as visas, for instance, as simple as that. And that was quite extraordinary. That was about intertrade amongst African countries. That model needs to be replicated. We need to talk to those very simple issues. On the face of it, simple, but can be quite complex. We need to be able to build upon the model and in so doing, showcase to the world that we as Africans can get on with our own business.
Why is it such a difficult model to construct here? Because, a crucial supplement will be to actually build on these meaningful regional relationships. And, it's something that the continent as a whole has boasted pretty poor results on as a whole, with the substantial exception of the East African community. I mean, where are we stepping wrong?
Well, we're very critical amongst ourselves, and let's also salute ourselves. Just recently there was a COMESA filing in terms of, just from a legal perspective, of a filing regarding the competition matter, where local companies were able to file, in terms of merger and acquisition filing, a filing in COMESA. Now, that I think is a great step forward. It shows collaboration. We have in Malawi the headquarters of the competition regional headquarters, and that showed on a very, very pertinent basis cooperation amongst countries in this particular region, in the East and Southern African region, on a very fundamental basis, regulatory basis, commercial basis, and so on. I think we're quite hard on ourselves to say that there isn't any traction. I think there's great development, for instance, in the North-South corridor. In that particular area, in the Peter and Pika projects driven by our president and also by the AU. So I think there are great strides, and I think we've got to take those positives and build upon them. And that's why I like this particular forum's title, Delivering on Africa's Promise. There seems to be purpose, that's the message. I've also heard the commentators now in regard to maybe it's too South African focused and orientated. We've got to look at diversification. We've got to try and broaden the network in regard to the attendance at the WEF. That is certainly on the agenda. But quite frankly, I think the participants that have drawn, as our guests have said, they've drawn from across the world. There's world attention. And I think you can only grow from strength to strength. Forums like this, Alicia, are vitally important for the continent. They draw attention to ourselves. It creates a swirl, it creates an interest, and it certainly gives access to voices which sometimes aren't necessarily heard. And there I'm still thinking about civil society.